Part 1. Check-in. Sarah arrived at the Stanley Hotel closer to the evening. The sun was already hiding behind the peaks of the Rocky Mountains, casting long shadows on the white facade of the building. She parked her car and paused for a moment, gazing at the massive hotel standing amidst the picturesque nature of Colorado. She had dreamed of coming here for a long time. As a fan of mystical stories, she couldn't pass up the chance to visit the place that had inspired Stephen King's The Shining. Legends spoke of mysterious sounds in the empty hallways, ghostly children laughing at night, and room 217, where one could still hear the voice of a woman who had died there many years ago. Even though she felt a bit uneasy, she brushed the feeling off. It was just stories. Inside, the hotel was stunning in its elegance: wooden paneling, antique chandeliers, a red carpet stretching down the long hallways. The atmosphere was unusual. It felt as if the air vibrated with something unseen. Sarah approached the reception desk, where a friendly man in uniform stood. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes, for one night." The check-in process was quick, and within a minute, she was holding her key. She had been assigned room 213 on the second floor. She noticed that room 217, the one everyone talked about, was nearby. As she climbed the stairs, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. Someone was behind her. She turned sharply, but there was only a long, empty hallway. Just tired, she told herself. Opening the door to her room, Sarah let out a relieved sigh. The room looked perfectly normal: antique furniture, a large bed, a bedside lamp. The only thing that unsettled her was the mirror opposite the door. It was so large that it reflected almost the entire room. To distract herself, she walked over to the window and pulled back the curtains. The room overlooked the hotel's backyard, where old benches and swings swayed gently in the wind. "Nice view, isn't it?" Sarah flinched and turned around. A young woman, about 30, with dark hair, stood in the doorway. She smiled. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. I'm your neighbor. I'm in 215. I'm Julia." Sarah laughed in relief. "It's okay. I'm just a little on edge after the drive." "I get it. This isn't my first time here either." Julia tilted her head as if lost in thought. "To be honest, this place is unusual." Sarah looked at her with interest. "Has something happened?" Julia hesitated, as if deciding whether or not to share. Then she nodded toward the mirror. "If I were you, I'd cover it. At night, it can be uncomfortable." Sarah felt another chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" Julia just smiled. "You'll see." She left, closing the door behind her. Sarah glanced at the mirror. It looked ordinary, but now it seemed as if the room in its reflection appeared slightly different. She decided not to think about it. Turning off the light, Sarah got into bed. That night, a noise woke her up. Someone was knocking on the door. Part 2. The neighbor's disappearance. Sarah opened her eyes. At first, she didn't understand what had woken her up, but then she heard it again: 3 light knocks on the door. She glanced at her phone: 2 a.m. Who could be coming at this hour? Maybe Julia. But why? She hesitated, but eventually climbed out of bed, walked to the door, and, holding her breath, opened it. The hallway was empty. She leaned forward cautiously, looking left and right. The dim lighting cast eerie shadows from the chandelier onto the walls. Maybe she had imagined it. Sarah shrugged and was about to close the door when, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something near the door of the neighboring room, 215. A small white slip of paper lay on the floor. She took a step forward, bent down, and picked it up. It was a note, written in shaky handwriting: "Help me. She's watching." Her heart fluttered. What did that mean? She raised her hand to knock on Julia's door but hesitated. The room was silent. Not a single sound, not even breathing behind the door. Suddenly feeling cold sweat on her skin, Sarah hurried back into her own room and locked the door. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, gripping the note tightly. Maybe Julia wasn't in her room? Maybe she had written this for someone else. But if so, for whom? And who was watching? These thoughts wouldn't leave her alone, but eventually, exhaustion won, and she drifted off to sleep. The morning was gloomy. As soon as she woke up, Sarah immediately remembered the events of the night. She quickly got dressed and stepped into the hallway, glancing toward room 215. The door was closed. She knocked, but no one answered. She waited a few more seconds, then knocked harder. Silence. She decided to ask at the front desk. Heading downstairs, she approached the same man who had checked her in the night before. "Excuse me, do you know where the guest from room 215 might have gone?" The hotel employee looked up at her with a puzzled expression. 215. But that room is empty. Empty. Sarah stiffened. But there was a woman staying there yesterday, Julia. We talked. The man shook his head. We don't have any record of a guest by that name in 215. Sarah felt her breath catch. But I saw her. She came to my room. The employee looked at her as if he had heard this before. You wouldn't be the first to say that, he murmured, leaning in slightly. A lot of people talk about seeing people who aren't supposed to be here. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Are you saying that? I'm not saying anything, the man interrupted. But if you're feeling uneasy, it might be best for you to leave. She stared at him, unsure what to say. The note was still in her hand. If Julia had never been here, then who had left it? Sarah decided to act. She returned to the hallway and, without hesitation, pressed down on the handle of room 215. The door opened. The room was empty. No belongings, no signs that anyone had been staying there. But on the bed lay another slip of paper. They're coming for you. Sarah took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She was not alone here. Something, or someone, was watching her. Part 3. Mysterious Discoveries. Sarah froze in place, staring at the note. Her fingers clutched the thin paper so tightly that it crumpled slightly. They're coming for you. Her throat went dry, and her mind swarmed with thoughts. What did this mean? Who were they? She slowly scanned the room. Everything looked perfectly clean, as if no one had been here for a long time. But something in the air felt off, stale, heavy, as if it held the memory of something terrible. Sarah took a step forward and suddenly felt a crunch beneath her foot. She looked down, something was under the bed. Leaning down cautiously, she reached for the object and pulled it toward her. It was an old, worn leather-bound book, resembling a journal. She opened it, the pages were yellowed with age, some torn, but the writing was still legible. They looked like personal notes from someone who had once stayed in this room. I feel her watching me every night. She stands in the corner of the room, but I can't turn my head to look. If I move, she gets closer. If I breathe too loudly, she hears. I have to be silent. If you're reading this, please don't stay here overnight. She takes everyone who falls asleep. A cold sweat broke out on Sarah's skin. Whose notes were these? She quickly flipped through several pages and came across a name, Julia Marshall. Her heart pounded harder. Was this the same Julia she had spoken to? How was that possible? If the receptionist was telling the truth, there was never a Julia staying here. But if she was a ghost, then why did she seem so real? Sarah shut the journal and quickly left the room, leaving the note on the bed. She felt like reality itself was beginning to unravel. As she walked down the hallway, she noticed a housekeeper cleaning a window. The woman was older, with gray hair tightly pulled into a bun. "Excuse me," Sarah called out, "have you worked here long?" The woman nodded. Almost 30 years, she replied, still wiping the glass. Do you know anything about Julia Marshall? The housekeeper froze. For a moment, she looked as if she was afraid to speak, but finally, she sighed heavily. Julia, yes, she was here. A long time ago. Sarah felt her breath hitch. What happened to her? The woman looked at her with sorrowful eyes. She disappeared. Like so many others. What do you mean, disappeared? She checked in alone, but no one ever saw her leave. Her belongings were left in the room, but she was nowhere to be found. The police said she probably just left in the middle of the night, but I don't believe that. Sarah tightened her grip on the journal. You're saying this has happened to others? The woman nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. This hotel has many stories best left untold. At night, there is always someone else here. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She needed to get out of here. Without waiting for nightfall, she packed her things, grabbed the journal, and hurried to the elevator. The doors slid open, and she stepped inside, pressing the button for the first floor. The elevator began to descend, but suddenly, it stopped between floors. The lights flickered. In the mirror across from the doors, something appeared. She was there. Julia. Pale, with hollow eyes, she was staring directly at her. And she whispered, "You can't leave now." The elevator plummeted downward. Part 4. The Nightmare. Sarah screamed as her stomach lurched from the elevator's sudden drop. The lights flickered, the mirror trembled as if it was about to shatter. She tried to grab onto the railing, but the elevator screeched to a halt, nearly knocking her off her feet. A heavy jolt, then silence. The lights went out. Her breathing was ragged, her heart hammering in her chest, and one thought pulsed in her mind, this is real. Her fingers trembled as she reached into her pocket for her phone. The screen glowed, no signal. She pressed the emergency call button, but there was only silence. And then something changed. The air in the elevator turned ice cold. A thick, putrid smell filled the space, forcing Sarah to cover her nose with her hand. She wasn't alone. Slowly, very slowly, she raised her eyes to the mirror. At first, she saw only her own reflection, wide, terrified eyes, pale face, slightly parted lips. But then, something moved behind her. A shadow, blurred and dark, taking on a more defined shape with every second. A figure. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with long arms hanging at its sides. Its hair was disheveled, covering part of its face. And its eyes were hollow. Black voids that swallowed the light. Sarah froze, paralyzed with fear. The entity tilted its head, studying her. Then, something in the mirror shifted. It was gone. Only Sarah remained in the reflection, alone. But she could feel it. Something brushed against her shoulder. A whisper. She gasped and jerked away, frantically pressing every button, praying for the elevator to move. The doors creaked. They were opening. Sarah didn't wait. She bolted out and found herself in a dark hallway. But something was wrong. This floor, it didn't look like the ones she had seen before. The walls were old, cracked, with peeling wallpaper revealing mold-covered wooden panels. The air was thick, stale, as if it had been trapped here for years. Behind her, the elevator groaned. As if it had hit something unseen, the doors slammed shut. Sarah turned around. The numbers on the doors didn't make sense, just digits, no room names. She took a cautious step forward, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. Then, she heard it. Someone was walking toward her from the darkness. The steps were slow, heavy, uneven, like whoever was approaching was injured. Or, broken. Sarah backed away, trying to peer into the shadows. She wasn't sure if this was the hotel anymore. It looked like it, but at the same time, it didn't. It felt like another version of the building. A version that was never meant to exist. Her fingers fumbled for her phone to turn on the flashlight, but then, a voice. A whisper from the darkness. Sarah. It wasn't human. The voice was stretched, mechanical, as if someone was trying to say her name without understanding what it meant. She broke into a run. She sprinted down the hallway, but it felt endless. Door after door after door, all locked. She grabbed at the handles, twisting them, but none would budge. The footsteps behind her quickened. Finally, one door creaked open. She lunged inside, slammed it shut, and pressed her back against it. Silence. She tried to steady her breathing, keeping as quiet as possible. The room was dark, with only a faint sliver of light from the hallway slipping in beneath the door. She turned around. This wasn't a normal hotel room. There was no bed. No furniture. Only an old, rotting wardrobe standing in the corner. And then, the wardrobe doors started to open. Slowly. Sarah wanted to scream, but only a choked gasp left her throat. She watched as something emerged from the darkness inside. It looked human, but it was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skeletal fingers wrapped around the edges of the door. Its hair hung over its face, and she knew, she didn't want to see what was underneath. A whisper brushed against her ear. They're already here. The hallway light flickered, and then went out. Sarah was left in the dark. Part 5. Descent into the basement. Darkness swallowed her from all sides, and Sarah felt something cold touch her hand. It wasn't just a light brush, fingers, dry and long, wrapped around her wrist. She yanked her hand back, her heart hammering in her chest, her breathing shallow. Something was moving in the dark. It had no clear form, only a blurred sense of presence, and that whisper. Soft, nearly indistinct, as if countless voices were murmuring in her ear all at once. Sarah backed away until she felt the wall behind her. She couldn't stay here. She had to find a way out. She shut her eyes, trying to steady herself, to focus. Phone. She quickly pulled it from her pocket, switched on the flashlight, and lifted it abruptly in front of her. The beam of light caught the wardrobe, its doors now slightly ajar. But there was nothing inside. No figure. No entity. Only darkness, which somehow felt alive. Then she noticed something on the floor. Under the glow of her phone, she saw footprints, dark, damp, barefoot impressions. They led from the wardrobe to the door and down the hallway. Sarah hesitated, but staying here was even worse. She stepped into the corridor, carefully following the tracks. The elevator doors were shut. The button didn't work. The only way was down. She moved cautiously, listening to the echo of her own footsteps in the depths of the hotel. Each floor felt darker, more abandoned. The walls were damp with patches of mold, the wallpaper peeling away in jagged strips. The air thickened, heavy and stale. She no longer knew which floor she was on. It felt as if the building had grown, stretching beyond what it should be. At the end of the hallway, she saw an old wooden door, slightly ajar. A faint draft seeped through the gap. She pushed it open wider and saw a staircase descending into darkness. The basement? But, did the Stanley Hotel even have a basement? She remembered the stories. Guests often reported hearing sounds from below, but no one ever knew what was down there. She didn't want to go down. But the footprints led straight into the blackness. Each step down echoed like a drumbeat in the silence. The lower she went, the less it felt like the hotel above. At the bottom, a dim, yellowish glow seeped through a tiny, grimy window near the ceiling. Sarah lifted her flashlight and looked around. It looked like an old service level. Wooden shelves, thick with dust. Rusty pipes running along the walls. Abandoned furniture draped in cobwebs. Then she saw it. A large wooden table with scattered, yellowed papers. She stepped forward, picked one up, and began to read. October 21st, 1911. This is my last night here. She's coming for me. I know it. I saw her in the mirror. She took the others, and now it's my turn. If anyone finds this, don't stay in this hotel past midnight. You will be next. Sarah's hands turned ice cold. This couldn't be a coincidence. 1911, that was the year of the gas explosion in room 217. The year a housekeeper supposedly survived. But did she really? Or, was it her? The suffocating sense of being watched became unbearable. Sarah turned her flashlight, scanning the room. Then she heard it. A sound behind her. Something heavy, like a wooden chair, scraping against the floor. She spun around. In the far corner of the room stood a tall figure. A woman. Her face was partly hidden in shadow, but one thing was clear, her eyes were hollow black pits. She didn't move. Just stood there, head tilted. Sarah stepped backward. But the floor beneath her suddenly softened. Like she was standing on something alive. Everything around her shifted. The shelves sagged, the walls darkened. Sarah realized, this place had changed. She was no longer in the hotel's basement. She was, somewhere else. The figure began to move. Her motions were jerky, unnatural, as if her body refused to follow the laws of physics. She took a step forward. Sarah's legs refused to move. You will stay here. The voice rang inside her skull, as if spoken directly into her mind. Her phone flickered, the light dimming, then, darkness. The last thing she saw was the entity reaching for her. And then, nothing. Part 6. The unexpected ending. Darkness wrapped around her like thick, black velvet, swallowing her whole. Sarah felt her body tighten from the cold, the air around her growing denser, almost tangible to the touch. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. All sound had vanished, no breath, no echoing footsteps. Nothing. Only the unbearable sensation that she was no longer alone. Then, something shifted. The darkness began to stir. She wasn't sure if it was her imagination or if she was really seeing the silhouettes in the void moving closer. Shadowy figures, shaped like people, drifted around her, shifting like black smoke. And then, the voices. Soft at first. Then louder. Whispering. Crying. Pleading. We're here. We're here. She won't let us go. Sarah couldn't breathe. Cold, skeletal hands brushed against her skin. She tried to fight back, but her body refused to obey. She knew, if she stayed here, she would never leave. With every ounce of strength left in her, she struggled to break free. She didn't know if she was screaming aloud or if it was just inside her mind, but something snapped inside her, and the darkness began to retreat. Suddenly, she fell. Hard. The impact sent pain shooting through her body as she hit a solid surface, wooden floorboards. Her eyes flew open. She was back. In her room. Room 213. Lying in the middle of the floor, drenched in cold sweat, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. The light was on. The curtains were open. Everything looked normal, as if nothing had happened. But Sarah knew. This wasn't a dream. She remembered the basement. The hands pulling at her skin. The voices whispering their final warning. She turned her head. The journal was on the bed. Slowly, she reached for it and flipped it open. There was one last page she hadn't seen before. Written in red ink, rushed, desperate, if you're reading this, you still have a chance. But time is running out. Leave now. She knows you're here. Sarah's chest tightened. She grabbed her phone, 5 a.m. The sun was rising. She wasn't waiting another minute. Throwing her things into her bag, she ran out of the room, leaving the door wide open behind her. She took the stairs two at a time, nearly tripping in her rush to get to the lobby. The receptionist, the same man from the night before, looked up at her, puzzled. "Leaving so early?" Sarah didn't answer. She bolted outside, jumped into her car, and turned the key with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, and she sped off, never once looking back. The hotel disappeared in the rearview mirror. She drove for miles, only stopping when she reached a roadside diner. Shutting off the engine, she sat still, trying to catch her breath. Her hands were still trembling. She pulled out her phone, opened her browser, and typed, "List of missing persons, Stanley Hotel." A random website. An article. Photos. Her heart stopped. Among the old, grainy black and white pictures of missing guests, Julia Marshall. Vanished in 1993. Last seen at 2 a.m., second floor hallway. Sarah's throat went dry. But that wasn't the worst part. At the bottom of the list, another name. Sarah Bennett. Missing. Last registered stay, Stanley Hotel, room 213. Her name. Her own name. She checked the date. Today's date. The phone slipped from her hands. The end. What would you do in Sarah's place? Would you stay to uncover the truth or run the moment things got strange? Let me know in the comments. Like and subscribe for more terrifying stories. You won't want to miss the next one.